welcome you all. I guess it's this afternoon, but just a couple minutes. It's great to have here to welcome you all to the Roy and Susan Palmer Civil Liberties Civil Rights Prize. And Roy and Susan are here today. Thank you, Roy and Susan. Came to me a little bit after 9/11 and said, what we really need is more sustained scholarly focus on the intersection between collective security and individual liberties. And that, like, one of the interests that prompted Roy was reading a book about what happened during World War II here in this country when some Nazi saboteurs were caught. They were totally inexpert. It was a very strange operation from the beginning, and it was not like the Nazi war machine. And the question is, what then would our government do with them? How could they be tried under what conditions? Would they be combatants, as those term has since been used, or would they had some kind of rights to due process, because two of them were actually U.S. citizens. And so the idea came is, what happens in a time of war? What happens in a time of sustained war? How do we understand civil liberties? And we need to have more scholarship flesh out these ideas. Obviously, things have changed since 9/11. Things will change each period of time as new threats, new drones, new kind of challenges and new opportunities arise. And certainly we have not had a talk on civil rights and civil liberties since the release of papers by Edward Snowden. And I think that's going to reshape how academics approach issues in the future as well. I don't think the talk will necessarily touch on Snowden's papers, but certainly they sort of color our understanding of secrecy and dispatch. So without any more, I'm delighted to introduce to you Vanderbilt professor Ganesh Sitaraman, who will talk about his book, The Counterinsurgency Constitution. Now think about the international framework for thinking about what he calls small wars, something that is not consistent with our old focus, our legendary focus on World War I, World War II, and so forth. So with that, Ganesh. By the way, there'll be plenty of time for questions and book signing afterwards.
Thank you, Dean Krent, for that wonderful introduction. I'm very excited to be here in Chicago. I got here a little bit late last night, but regardless of what Jon Stewart says, tonight we'll be having Chicago South. But seriously, it is terrific to be here, and to be here at Chicago, Kent in particular. It's a great honor to receive the Palmer Prize, and Roy and Susan, I want to thank you for your vision. You recognized years ago that as a country we're committed to our ideals, but that we also face real dangers. And your generosity, I think, helps ensure that we have people thinking not only about what is expedient, but also about what is right. So I want to take all of you back to 2009. That summer, General Stanley McChrystal, the commander of U.S. and NATO forces in Afghanistan, issued a tactical directive governing the use of force by all U.S. and NATO forces. "We will not win based on the number of Taliban we kill," he wrote. "This is different from conventional combat, and how we operate will determine the outcome more than traditional measures like capture of terrain or attrition of enemy forces." The directive stressed the importance of limiting civilian casualties and preventing excessive damage, and it significantly curtailed the use of air attacks and air support. In effect, soldiers and Marines were told that if they were in a civilian area and there was a risk of civilian casualties because of air support, then they were not allowed to use air support unless it was absolutely necessary for their self-defense. I think this should seem shocking to you. How could it be that the general who ran special operations raids in Iraq was saying that victory was not defined by the number of Taliban killed? And how could it be that the military was ordering troops in the field to do everything they could to avoid civilian casualties? The answer is counterinsurgency strategy. Now, despite years of military operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, the publication of the Army's Counterinsurgency Field Manual, and pages and pages and pages of analysis by scholars and historians and policymakers on counterinsurgency, there's still considerable confusion about what this term means. So here's a simple definition. Counterinsurgency is the military, paramilitary, political, economic, psychological, and civic actions taken by a government to defeat insurgency. Now, this definition probably seems very broad to you, and it should seem very broad to you. On this definition, counterinsurgency operations include killing and capturing insurgents, but also reconciling with them, arming local militias, but also training state-run security forces, working with local power brokers, but also rooting out corruption. The definition has something of a flavor of everything in the kitchen sink to it, and so it's not terribly useful to just say counterinsurgency is anything that helps you defeat an insurgency. You've got to have something more to it. So what do we mean by counterinsurgency strategy? I think as a strategy, counterinsurgency can take three basic forms: repressive counterinsurgency, minimalist counterinsurgency, and progressive counterinsurgency. Repressive counterinsurgency takes a hardline approach. Victory is nothing less than a territory in which the insurgency is completely eradicated, and to attain this goal, the repressive counterinsurgent is willing to adopt brutal means. Military operations against the enemy are the central tactic for reducing insurgent strength. Population control measures, from curfews to resettlement programs, enable the counterinsurgent to control the local environment tightly. And military operations, even against the people themselves, can punish the people for supporting the insurgency and encourage them to stop providing intelligence and support to the enemy. Minimalist counterinsurgency doesn't try to eradicate the insurgency completely, but instead to manage the insurgent problem in the short to medium term. Success simply means reducing violence now. Reconciliation and reintegration are perhaps the most important tactics for minimalist counterinsurgency because they seek to end the insurgency by co-opting the insurgents. Counterinsurgents can also buy off local actors or power brokers. And counterterrorism is another important tactic because it manages the worst parts of the violence. Progressive counterinsurgency embraces the idea that warfighting is state building, and that the only way to achieve a sustainable order is to gain the trust, obligation, and support of the people. Progressive counterinsurgency aims for complete victory, but it seeks victory primarily through persuasion rather than force. It focuses on building, or in some cases rebuilding, the institutions of the state. Programs in security, governance, rule of law, economic stability can help win the support of the population and thereby reduce the support that people provide to the insurgents. Progressive counterinsurgency is a tough path. It operates over an extremely long period of time, precisely because it is difficult to win over people's trust, because people might justifiably fear or have little faith in their government. I think rightly understood, the counterinsurgency strategy of General Petraeus, General McChrystal, is a progressive counterinsurgency strategy. And for simplicity, I'll just refer to it as counterinsurgency from now on. But I want to underscore how radical a strategy this is. Progressive counterinsurgency turns conventional warfare on its head. Counterinsurgents speak of winning hearts and minds. They argue that killing insurgents might not result in victory, and that protecting the civilian population is the best way to defeat the insurgency. Counterinsurgents recommend that military officials give greater discretion to subordinates, which undermines traditional notions of command hierarchy. And they even note that soldiers might have to take on greater risks to themselves in order to secure an area in the long term. Now, this isn't to say that there isn't killing or capturing in progressive counterinsurgency. There certainly is, and there can be quite a bit of it. But the focus, the central goal, central difference, is winning over the population. And achieving that goal often requires restraint. There's something else that's radical about progressive counterinsurgency. Since the time of Cicero, commentators have argued that the law is silent between arms, and that at its best, law can only precariously constrain military operations. Counterinsurgents, in contrast, argue that the law is central to success. The British counterinsurgency strategist Sir Robert Thompson once wrote, "The greatest importance should be attached to the Constitution, from which all authority is derived." David Kilcullen, an Australian counterinsurgency theorist, has said that a constitutional path is needed but lacking to counter global jihad. French counterinsurgent Roger Trinquier argued that the Army must apply the law without hesitation. And the U.S. Army and Marine Corps' counterinsurgency field manual says, "Establishing the rule of law is a key goal and end state." And the field manual mandates that U.S. forces follow domestic and international law in order to maintain their legitimacy. Counterinsurgency's commitment to law goes beyond the textbooks of these military strategists. Iraq and Afghanistan ratified and drafted and ratified constitutions while fighting insurgents. Millions of dollars were spent over the last decade to support law schools and courts, prisons, and bar associations, all in the name of building the rule of law. The difficulty of distinguishing between civilians and combatants has created significant legal controversy over the use of force and, in some cases, undermined legitimacy. Corruption among police and government forces threatens to undermine efforts at state building. And Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay have been a source of motivation for insurgents. In other words, legal questions and law play an important part in counterinsurgency operations. Now, in the book, I argue that law and counterinsurgency as a result are interconnected, and I explore the consequences for taking counterinsurgency strategies seriously on law and legal obligations. The book covers a very wide range of topics from occupation law to laws of war to transitional justice and human rights, policing strategy, and even constitutional design. And as Dean Krentz said, you can buy a copy right now. But today, what I thought we'd do is just focus narrowly and go back to this question, trying to understand General McChrystal's directive and what was going on with his statement in 2009. So General McChrystal says in his directive that legal and moral considerations support the policy, but he emphasizes primarily that the policy is grounded in strategic concerns. He writes, "The loss of popular support will be decisive to either side in the struggle. The Taliban cannot militarily defeat us, but we can defeat ourselves." In other words, McChrystal's directive recognizes that counterinsurgency strategy requires restraint. This is an unconventional proposition, even recently in debates on the laws of war. In fact, in recent years, some have argued that the United States and its allies in counterinsurgency operations and in counterterrorism can ignore the laws of war altogether. They argue that the laws of war are based on the concept of reciprocity between nations, and that because terrorists and insurgents don't comply with the laws, the United States doesn't need to either. So Ruth Wedgwood, for example, has made a limited version of this argument. She says that to claim protection of the law, the side must generally conduct its own military operations in accordance with the laws of war. John Yoo, the former Bush administration official, has taken a fuller approach to this. He says, "The primary enforcer of the laws of war has been reciprocal treatment. We obey the Geneva Conventions because our opponent does the same with American POWs. That is impossible with Al-Qaeda." Now, the principle of reciprocity is one of the foundational ideas in the laws of war. It is defined as the relationship between two or more states according each other identical or equivalent treatment. By agreeing to act under equivalent terms, states constrain their actions without losing any military advantage. Reciprocity also has the benefit of making international law enforceable. Given that there's no global sovereign in the international system to punish those who violate international law, reciprocity in effect makes international law self-enforcing. So I'll give you an example. Consider a situation in which two countries make an agreement not to use exploding bullets in a conventional war. They are both better off if they cooperate because their soldiers will not go through the suffering that accompanies using exploding bullets. But if one side follows the ban on exploding bullets and the other side uses exploding bullets, the side that's using the bullets, the defecting side, is going to benefit because it'll likely kill and injure the opponent's soldiers faster. Violating the ban on exploding bullets is actually, it seems like a rational thing to do. But if the two countries know that they might face each other in battle multiple times, then following the ban, adhering to the ban, actually becomes rational for both sides. A country might violate the ban in the short term, gaining high benefits, but in the long run, their soldiers would face horribly destructive costs as the other side decides that it too must use exploding bullets to counteract their opponent. Both sides are therefore worse off. So instead, what happens is both sides follow the ban, and each benefits in the short run, each benefits in the long run. So the idea behind reciprocity is that the potential for future defection by the enemy is a check on a country's actions, and that's why you get cooperation. So in this theory, terrorists and insurgents are a pretty big challenge. Terrorists and insurgents are perennial defectors, which means that the enforcement part of reciprocity is meaningless. And this is why Wedgwood, you, and others question the relevance of reciprocity and question whether we should apply the laws of war. There have been two main responses to these critics. The first is that the laws of war are not primarily based on reciprocity, but are based on humanitarian principles. The humanitarian approach simply concedes that there's no self-interested reason to follow the laws of war in asymmetric situations at all, really. It's just based on moral considerations. Now, I think the problem with this is there's a lot of people out there who are simply not persuaded by the moral argument. They care more about the practicalities, they care more about military necessity, national security, exigencies. That's what they're interested in, that's what they see as a persuasive playing field. So that brings us to the second response, which is that reciprocity still works. It just works in more complicated kind of ways. So there's an argument of specific reciprocity, which says that even if it's unlikely terrorists will comply with the laws of war, if the United States violates those laws, terrorists might act even more ruthlessly than they would have otherwise. There's a diffuse reciprocity argument, which says that violating the laws of war will undermine humanitarian norms generally, and that may be harmful in the long run. And then there's an indirect reciprocity argument, which says that the United States, the US personnel might be treated poorly in future conflicts with other actors altogether, say a war between the United States and China, if that ever happened, based on the conduct of our personnel in this conflict. I think counterinsurgency offers an approach that is different than all of these, and is a little bit more persuasive because it is less indirect, less complicated, less convoluted. Reciprocity in the laws of war is based on two premises that are simply inapplicable in counterinsurgency. The first is that opponents are each better off using greater and greater violence to destroy the enemy, but that each side can reduce its costs if both limit certain tactics. The second is that if one side defects, the other side is at a disadvantage. And counterinsurgency's win the population strategy rejects these propositions. The counterinsurgent does not define victory based on destructive violence to kill and capture the enemy. Rather, counterinsurgency defines victory based on winning over the population. And that involves securing the population, ensuring essential services, providing governance, developing the economy, and communicating effectively. These operations often require limitations on destructive violence, not unleashing destructive violence. So the reason for the counterinsurgent to restrain itself is not out of reciprocity with the enemy to reduce mutual costs, it's out of pure unilateral advantage in accomplishing its goals. So this is critical. The win the population strategy does not turn on the operations of the insurgent enemy. Whether the insurgent is ruthless and vicious or lawful and humanitarian is irrelevant to the counterinsurgent strategy. Perversely, asymmetry might actually be helpful to the counterinsurgent's operations. Because the goal is to win over the population, a counterinsurgent that follows the laws of war might be at an even greater advantage in the context of an insurgency that is ruthless than in the context of an insurgency that is humane. A ruthless insurgent will alienate the population because it creates fear and terror among the people. A lawful and humane counterinsurgent, in contrast, and at the same time, will be gaining the legitimacy and support of the population by restraining itself and not using excessive force. So the counterinsurgent seeks legitimacy, and this is assisted by its adherence to law and humanity, and by the insurgent's disregard for law and humanity. So in sum, asymmetry doesn't undermine the interest-based justification for adhering to the law. It actually supports and deepens the reasons why we might want to support the laws of war. We can call this principle of strategic self-interest exemplarism. And I use exemplarism because exemplary conduct contributes to success. Exemplarism is an inherently asymmetric approach. It holds that a state can be bound to law regardless of the actions of other parties. In doing so, the exemplarist state gains in prestige, legitimacy, and power. Unlike indirect reciprocity, exemplarism is not conditioned on the future threat of retaliation by another party. Unlike diffuse reciprocity, following the law isn't based on the future threat of retaliation because community norms have been degraded. And exemplarism is also not based on moral or professional ideals of martial virtue or national self-respect. It is based on strategic self-interest in this conflict itself. In essence, this is what General McChrystal recognized and tried to institute in Afghanistan, a counterinsurgency strategy that was based on exemplary conduct. Unlike conventional war, which relies on reciprocity to push states toward compliance with the laws of war, counterinsurgency's win the population strategy furnishes this strategic, self-interested justification for following the laws. And in some cases, like in General McChrystal's directive, actually exceeding what the laws of war require. Now, this isn't to say humanitarian justifications are irrelevant. They're a very powerful reason for counterinsurgents to follow the laws of war. But I think the principle of exemplarism provides an additional reason and a response to the war on terror theorists who say that the U.S. does not need to follow the laws of war in asymmetric conflicts. It turns out that in counterinsurgency, what is right is also what is beneficial. Now, you might be skeptical of my argument for a whole host of reasons. I'll just pick a couple. First, you might think that there were a lot of civilian casualties in Iraq and Afghanistan. You might argue that Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo were major disasters and serious setbacks. You might say that we didn't implement counterinsurgency strategy as I've described it effectively. You might say we didn't implement it at all as I've described it. And you know what? You'd find people in the military and in the national security establishment who agree with you probably on every single one of those counts. In fact, in the last decade, the military and national security community have engaged in a serious and extensive debate on whether to embrace the progressive counterinsurgency strategy at all, to what extent it can actually be effective and implemented. And some people have argued that the military radically needs to reshape itself, including its training programs, education programs, operations, and rules, in order to better align with this kind of strategy. Others have said the military does best when it focuses on killing and capturing the bad guys, and that it shouldn't be involved in any of this other business. This is a debate that's been ongoing for 7 to 10 years. It is a debate that remains ongoing today. But I want to be clear, my argument is not about whether we effectively implemented the strategy in Iraq or Afghanistan or in any particular case. My argument is that if we take this strategy seriously, and if we want to adopt it, it turns out that it requires our military to act in line with law, and even to exceed the requirements of the law so that they can win over the population. It requires them to do this not only because we believe in the rule of law, not only because we have strong moral commitments as a country, but also because it is strategically beneficial to us. So for all the people who say that the law doesn't matter, to all the people who say we should just use more force and kill more people, my argument provides a clear response. Far from being inapplicable, the law is essential to success. Now, another argument you might have is that it doesn't really matter whether or not I'm right, because the Iraq War is over, Afghanistan's winding down, and nobody would be crazy enough to want to get involved in a high-intensity nation-building kind of operation again, or at least not in the short term. So, putting aside whether you think we should engage in these kinds of conflicts, I don't think we should assume that they will never happen again, and that we never will be engaged in them. Around the world, warfare isn't characterized anymore by amassed armies on pitched battlefields, or even by tank battalions maneuvering through enemy lines. We live in an age of insurgency. Insurgents are there, they hibernate in the shadows, they emerge only when ready for attack. They live among the people, they're indistinguishable from civilians, and they challenge legitimate and illegitimate governments in a struggle for power. Around the world, governments are grappling with challenges of insurgency. The armed conflict in Colombia has persisted from the 60s until the present with no decisive resolution. India has faced a Maoist insurgency since an uprising in 1967. More than 6,000 people have been killed in the conflict, including more than 1,000 in 2009. In southern Thailand, insurgents have frequently and repeatedly challenged the government. More than 3,000 people were killed between 2004 and 2008. Since 1969, the Philippines has waged war against an insurgency in the southern part of that country. Somalia has effectively been without a central government since 1991, with civil war, piracy, insurgency, terrorism, and an Ethiopian occupation, all existing side by side at various times in the last 2 decades. Obviously, Iraq since 2003, Afghanistan since 2001, and even before, Pakistan in the northwest frontier provinces, and in Baluchistan, Nepal, and the Maoists. The list goes on and on and on. And if all of that wasn't enough to convince you that there's insurgencies all over the world, just think about the debate we had in this country a couple of months ago about whether or not to intervene in Syria. In all the heated debate about Syria and whether the president should use military force against the Assad regime, most officials and analysts, probably for obvious reasons, refrained from using the phrases insurgency and counterinsurgency. But they're surprisingly appropriate to describe that conflict as well. You have insurgent rebel groups trying to overthrow a government, the Assad regime, and you have a government trying to counter those insurgents and defeat them. This is effectively an insurgency and counterinsurgency in a much more complicated scenario. So all of this is to say that counterinsurgency is going to remain relevant in the years to come. I think T.X. Hams, who's a leading modern theorist of irregular warfare, put it particularly well when he adapted a quote from Trotsky. He said, "We may not be interested in insurgency, but insurgency is interested in us." And I think regardless of whether we engage in full-scale counterinsurgency or assist others who are fighting their own insurgencies or think about intervening in places around the world that are mired in conflict for one reason or another, we must not ignore the lessons of counterinsurgency. If we are going to get engaged as a country in wars in far-flung places, we have to understand what we're getting into. As a great democracy, I think we are unlikely to embrace a purely repressive strategy. We may want at times to just be minimalists, but often we are going to think and want a progressive counterinsurgency strategy. And that kind of strategy will require quite a bit of us. It will require us to win over the population by supporting governance, rebuilding the economy, creating sustainable security, all of which are costly, time-intensive, and difficult. And it will require our warriors to use restraint. Restraint in warfare may seem unconventional, but progressive counterinsurgency strategy holds that legality and efficacy, humanity and security are not in conflict. When we uphold our values, we actually have a better chance of accomplishing our goals.
There's plenty of time for questions.
Yeah, I can just,
Most importantly,
try to just call on people.
Yeah, I'll start. Steve.
Thank you for that very interesting talk. And I wanted to ask you where you think the U.S. counterinsurgency strategy stands with regard to Afghanistan in light of the new agreement that was, I think, announced yesterday. I heard a retired general on MSNBC yesterday morning expressing great skepticism about the number of troops that we were talking about continuing to station in Afghanistan, and suggesting that it was pretty much pointless, that we were only going to continue to be engaged with Taliban troops, or else we were just going to be sitting on the sideline not really doing anything. What's your sense about the future of our strategy in Afghanistan?
So I should start by saying I haven't read the full agreement. It just came out yesterday. I haven't seen the full thing, so I can't comment specifically on exactly what it says beyond roughly what it's in the papers. I think the starting point is that this is a different kind of phase. As far as I've read from the papers, it assumes a much, much lower number of U.S. forces who are there, and from what the reports have said, primarily focused on training and support. That is very different from the kind of progressive strategy of nation building, state building, that at various times in our now more than a decade engagement in Afghanistan has been what we were trying to do. So this is not that. And I don't think anyone is assuming that it is or will be, or if they are, they will be deeply disappointed, because that's not what this seems to be. I think it's unclear, partly because I haven't read the document, but to what extent this will look more like support programs we have in other places. So one of the things that has been highly successful that people don't talk much about, obviously the context is a little bit different, is in the Philippines there's been an insurgency for many, many years, and the United States actually has a group of special forces who are there, who are assisting the Filipino government with this insurgency. And they don't conduct any operations themselves, they're not involved in that, but they provide training and support and kind of best practice knowledge about how to work on security and other kinds of things. And from most accounts, that seems to be a successful kind of indirect approach at helping counterinsurgency efforts rather than a direct approach of doing it yourself. So it's unclear to me whether this is more like that, or if there's still a kind of heavier component of counterterrorism operations that are likely to continue with this. in part because there's still an Al-Qaeda presence and that is risky to the United States in that area. So I suspect that's maybe where this is more moving, is to something focused on supporting the Afghan government and a kind of minimum counterterrorism presence rather than something that looks more like nation building.
Thank you. Your ideas are very appealing, but also seem to be extremely difficult to implement for many reasons, including, among others, that if we went in to help suppress an insurgency, that would suggest support for the government that may itself be a big part of the problem. I'm wondering if you know of any examples in human history where an approach like yours has been successful or somewhat successful?
Yeah, so this is a good question. It's one that people ask of people who talk about counterinsurgency frequently. There are, so one of the challenges, there's methodological challenges in thinking through this problem. So there are some examples that people say are successful, but they have other factors going on at the same time. So it's hard to disaggregate which factors were the ones that may be different. So one of the most prominent examples where people conventionally talk about this being successful is the British in Malaya in the 50s. And effectively, there was a very repressive form of counterinsurgency. So this is the kind of conventional history, and there's revisionist histories and lots of complexity around it, but I'll give you the conventional story. The conventional story is there was a very repressive strategy for a few years that involved resettling people, putting them in horrible conditions. It was a total disaster. Then they replaced the commander, they brought in some new people, and they took a totally different approach. They created village councils, they improved the quality of participation among people, and over time, in a relatively short span of a number of years, dramatically reduced the level of violence and the insurgency in the early to mid-50s. This is generally seen as on the conventional story as a successful change in how one strategy you move to the next and you reduce this insurgent problem. It's difficult to say that's exactly right because of another feature going on in most insurgencies in the last 100 years, which is colonialism, imperialism, and decolonization. And so at the same time this is going on in Malaya, there is a decolonization process going on, and at the end of this, Malaya becomes Malaysia and becomes an independent country. So it's hard to disaggregate how much the strategy versus the separate fact of them becoming their own country was really the driving force behind the reduction of violence. And I think in some ways, though, that almost gets at the core problem, I think, and the core solution of how a counterinsurgency strategy should work. Ultimately, this is a political kind of warfare. It assumes that there is something going on that's deeper in the conflict, deeper in the country than just the violence. The violence is the symptom, not the disease. And so addressing the underlying disease is the issue. And in some cases, that might mean a country doesn't want to be a colony anymore. It wants to be independent. So you can call the American Revolution an insurgency against a British imperial counterinsurgent, the result of which was independence for the country, or what became a country. So there's this problem of how do you define and figure out what exactly the scope of the problem is, and if you can address that, regardless of whether it's a political grievance, an economic issue, repression, who knows what it is, that kind of gets at that issue.
As laudable as the progressive approach seems to be, do you think a warlike country like the United States can ever adopt that as a national policy?
I think as a national policy, we can adopt whatever we want to adopt, and that we can actually accomplish those things. And I'm pretty optimistic actually about this, because one of the, and I think there's good cause for optimism. I mean, it's not just that we have a efficient, effective war-fighting machine in our military, but we have a very, very disciplined machine in our military. Now, there are certainly problems, and there have been, but they are still the best trained fighting force in the world. And one of the things about good training is that you are trained to use restraint. And it is possible, I think, to have a strategy like this, to embrace it, to decide this is what you want to do. I think the challenge is not to the extent we have a challenge, it's not necessarily that we are warlike. I think the challenge is how resource intensive and complicated these conflicts are. It actually requires a lot to do this kind of thing in terms of time, money, knowledge of the foreign country and its local conditions. One of the most, I think, striking and shocking things about counterinsurgency is how, when you read the works of theorists, they all say, all strategists and theorists, have kind of a deep anthropology about them. If they could tell you what you need to do, what they would say is learn the local language, get to know the local people, eat their food, live with them, understand what's really happening in a place. That is very difficult to do. And that takes a long time, it takes a lot of effort. I mean, you can ask how many people knew, the difference between Dari and Pashto, two prominent languages in Afghanistan in 2000, fall of 2001, and what does that bode for our ability to do nation building in someone else's country? You could ask how many people know the kind of breakdown of different provinces, districts, villages in Afghanistan, and how difficult that is. You could ask how many people know that in your home state. Can you name your city councilor, your state representative, your state senator, and so on? But this kind of granular information about everything is very difficult and very resource intensive. I think that is probably the hardest barrier to trying to address this kind of thing. The restraint part, I feel like the military, when it puts its mind to things like that, is actually pretty good at doing it. The difficulty is turning a big ship like the United States military is very, very difficult. It takes a long time to do. Yeah.
So, I agree with much that you said. I sort of want to go into Joan's question a little bit more. And so wasn't the U.S. response to much of the Cold War, in fact, counterinsurgency? So the idea of progressive counterinsurgency, I think, is actually a really, old idea. I think it needs to be revived, and you're doing that well. But we have a very long history of engaging in exactly the types of programs that you're talking about, right? And the growth of area studies programs as reaction to the Cold War. Some of our Cold War policies actually led to really bad, things. So even the progressive approach to counterinsurgency can in fact have significant bad consequences depending upon how you use it. So I guess the question I have for you is, how does your approach differ from, in fact, our Cold War approach that really went to both in Europe, in Africa, and Latin America?
So Europe, Africa, Latin America. So I was going to use the other example, which is Vietnam, which is another place. And I think the big case is in each of these cases, and in Iraq and Afghanistan, when you dig into what's happening, it turns out there's lots of debate. And in Vietnam, when you read histories of Vietnam, you see there are places where certain groups within, and we'll just take the military, but certain groups within the military think the right metric for winning, yes, we need to learn everything, but the reason is the right metric for winning is body count. How many people have we killed in a certain period of time, and that is the metric that tells you if you're winning or not. And then you have other people who say that is exactly backwards. That has nothing to do with what we're trying to do. In fact, it may be the opposite, because the more you're killing people, you may be alienating other people. But the more you have to kill people, it means the less secure an area is. And if the goal is a stable, secure area that doesn't have that much violence, in fact, low body counts might mean low violence levels, which might be a good thing. So you see that debate there, and I think you see that debate throughout. So I guess where I I guess what I would say is I wouldn't characterize there as being one kind of Cold War approach. In fact, throughout all of this time, there have been multiple approaches and multiple debates about exactly what it means to wage war against insurgents. And this goes far back before the Cold War. I mean, it goes back, hundreds of years in some cases. Early, French counterinsurgency efforts in Madagascar, in Indochina, Vietnam area, Southeast Asia, 100 years ago, around 1900, all have flavors of this debate to them as well.
Yeah, so I don't know anything about history or politics, so I'm going to ask you about the theory. So when John Yoo looks at this problem, right, he sees a prisoner's dilemma, and his response to the prisoner's dilemma is to apply game theory and say, well, the answer is tit for tat, right? Base your behavior on your expectations of how the other side is going to behave, right? And make some judgment about the best case scenario based on that. So I'm trying to figure out what you agree with him about, and then what you would do based on that, right? Do you see the world also as a matter of prisoners' dilemmas? And the solution to the problem is different. The solution isn't reciprocity and tit for tat. It's a different approach to the game theory, and that game theory approach is now, exemplary counterinsurgency. Right? Because I think that's what you said, right? And if so, then what's the decision procedure, right? So when I'm confronted with a choice between behavior A and behavior B, right? Do I detain these people as war criminals or not? Do I try them or not? What does your theory tell us? How does your theory tell us how to answer that problem? Right? Is it always do the best? Is it always do what's humanitarian? Right? So how what's the decision procedure we get to when we get confronted inevitably with the choices of different kinds of behaviors?
Right. So one of the things that I think is important that you get out of this question is the relationship between strategy and law, and particularly in this case, military strategy and international law. And there is not, surprisingly, there are very few people who think about these two areas as linked together, when in fact, historically, the creation of international law and laws of war has largely been driven by or constrained by what countries have believed their strategy is, because countries tend not to like to sign up for treaties that go against what their strategy might be in the next war. They like to sign up for treaties where they think they might still be able to effectively wage wars and win them. So I think part of it links up to how you think about the strategy, and that's part of what's underlying the project and the book. So in any particular context, I wouldn't say, or in a general sense, I wouldn't say I support all game theory reasoning and no moral reasoning, or all moral reasoning and no game theory reasoning. I think you support each of the different types of reasoning at different times and to different degrees, and that all of them are valid considerations and helpful lenses through which to look at a particular problem. The issue here is, how does your strategy link up to the legal structure? And I think my argument is that the strategic concerns that undergird how we thought about conventional warfare, which goes back to Clausewitz and beforehand. Clausewitz is the best theorist of it, which is effectively that you have two sets of armies. They are going to fight each other. The one who defeats the other army, defined by killing and capturing the most number of enemy forces wearing uniforms on the battlefield, wins the battle. And except for in kind of Pyrrhic victory cases, right? So you mostly win the battle, and then if you win enough of those, you eventually win the war. And this is the general sense of it. Civilians aren't part of the fight. This is why it's on a pitched battlefield. And in fact, when you go back and read histories, you see these cases where people come out, civilians come out and sit on a bluff to watch the battle going on below them. They're not part of it. They're there watching the spectacle of the battle. So that's a different structure of warfare and a different strategy for victory than what happens in these asymmetrical conflicts, in which no one's meeting on battlefields. The other side's not wearing any uniforms usually. And that context is very different and requires a different kind of strategy to think about it. And so I guess my answer is that the decision theory is partly dependent on what the overall context is. And when you're in a completely different context, you might apply different structures of what their justifications are for, in this case, what the justifications are for being restrained in the use of force.
Yeah. So I was wondering if you could follow up with some of your answers to previous questions. When you talk about counterinsurgency actually having a long history, going back to the Cold War, maybe back further, American Revolutionaries, but you probably go back further than that. So I had the pleasure of reading your terrific book, and it seemed like one of the points of your book was that something new is going on here, that there are new issues arising, and we need to think about them in new ways. But then it seems like some of your comments are there's nothing new under the sun, at least phenomena have been there, and also the responses have run the gamut from progressive to regressive. So I was wondering if you could talk more about if indeed there is something new, and if so, what that is.
So I'm generally a proponent of there's usually nothing new under the sun in most things. We've had a long history as human beings. So most things have been tried or said. There are some things here that are different. I think the biggest difference is how we view the world now. That's one big difference. And the conventional way we think about things, and the conventional way we have for a long time, particularly though since the Cold War, particularly since World War II and the Cold War, is through the lens of big wars. And this is what Dean Krenn mentioned at the beginning. We think about big wars as the way we define wars. So we look at World War I, we look at World War II, we look at the Civil War. These are our paradigmatic understandings of conflict, when in fact, there is a lot that is different about modern warfare, and different about how we think about it. So one example that I talk about in the book is if you think about the paradigm that we all have of war and peace, we think that war ends and then peace begins. And there is a conflict phase and there is a post-conflict phase. And we talk about post-conflict reconstruction, and transitional justice happens in a post-conflict world, and that's when you build the rule of law. You fight the war, you win the war, then you write a new constitution. It all happens after. Well, that turns out not to be the case. In Iraq and Afghanistan, they wrote constitutions, built the rule of law, whatever that means, we can debate about that. Engaged in transitional justice, tried Saddam Hussein, for example, all while fighting against an insurgency. People were still getting killed. There was still military operations going on at the same time. So war and peace is not a clean line, and in some ways that is actually new, or newer, because legally at least, under the conventional war model, wars began and ended at very, very specific times. And you see this in declarations of war from 100 years ago, when they will say that the war began at exactly 6 p.m. on such and so day. And at that moment, that minute is when the war began. And this was important because war triggered a whole host of legal conditions and obligations, and you had to know the exact minute when it started and the exact minute when it ended. Well, these kinds of wars don't have that kind of exact minute when it ends component to them. And I think this in some ways gets back to the first question. If there's still a presence in Afghanistan, in some ways things move into different phases, but it may not end in the same way that you could say you have a peace treaty, the war is over, and then the next day you write the Constitution, build the rule of law, engage in transitional justice, do all the post-conflict reconstruction that we think of. It doesn't fit the model of World War II and then the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan happens while you're fighting the war. And I think that's a difference that is important and significant here, that is primarily different than how we think about this. Yeah.
I wonder if you'd say a few words about the Iraqi surge and the Sunni awakening and where, if at all, that fits into your
Yeah, so for people who don't know, in mid to late 2000s, 5 years ago or so, there was a lot of violence in Iran. And a number of things all happened around the same time that eventually led to a massive drop in violence. And there is debate among people who were participants and, I guess, current historians, historians of the recent present, of what was going on and what the causal effects there were. There are, I won't purport to present you with a theory of what the main factor was or anything like that, what the causal factor was, but there were, but I'll outline what some of a number of the factors were that resulted in the decline of violence. So One is the surge. The surge was an increase in the number of U.S. forces that were in Iraq. More forces, lower violence. That's one story. A second story is the more widespread adoption of counterinsurgency strategy and tactics. So at the same time that the surge was happening, this was when General Petraeus was in charge in Iraq, and when he was pushing very strongly for adoption of what is more like the counterinsurgency strategy, the progressive strategy that I've presented here, something more in that direction. So that's a second story of what was going on. A third story is what people call the awakening. And what this was a kind of realignment of interests within Iraq. So a number of Sunni groups and leaders who had previously been working with al-Qaeda in Iraq stopped working with them and started working with the US and coalition forces against al-Qaeda. And so that awakening is the kind of the realignment of the Sunnis in that area. And that is another potential game-changing factor at that time. Some people have suggested that a large chunk of the violence was linked also to segregation among Sunni and Shia in Iraq. So there were a lot of mixed neighborhoods, and in the period when the violence goes down, there were no longer a lot of mixed neighborhoods. They were separated neighborhoods. And so part of one theory is maybe that had kind of come to a completion in the sense that most neighborhoods were no longer mixed, and so that reduced violence. And then there's another theory that says that, in fact, part of it was there were groups in Iraq that had decided to create pacts and stop exercising as much violence as they had previously been doing so before. So that's I think that was 5 different theories, maybe 6 theories of what may have happened at that time. So as a historical matter, again, it's very difficult to disaggregate which of these or which combination of them were the most important. But counterinsurgency strategy is seen at least as one of the inputs that may have had a may have played a meaningful role in answering the question, why did violence go down in Iraq in the 2006 to 9 period?
And if I could, does the recent increase in violence, sectarian violence in Iraq, say anything about your theory?
I'm not sure I have much to say on that. There's a big difference between being involved in all as the United States and being involved as the United States. So I think that makes it more complicated. Someone back here has their hand way up. Yeah.
I happen to have been fully engaged in the progressive counterinsurgency strategy in Afghanistan all of 2011 as a JAG officer for a unit called the Rule of Law Field Force in Afghanistan, trying to put out judges in the provinces and districts, etc. I'm a JAG reservist Army. And so basically, since I came back, I've noticed a shift away from this strategy within the Army and the JAG Corps. So this is more of a comment than a question. Towards something called security force assistance, training other police forces, etc., on the rule of law, and less so, quote-unquote, nation building. So, evidence of this is that the U.S. Army JAG School in Charlottesville, Virginia, has stopped teaching the rule of law course. It used to be a week-long course. And they've supplanted it with a smaller course. So I was just wondering what your take on this is. Do you see a shift away from progressive counterinsurgency strategy within the armed forces? I certainly do.
Yeah, so the first thing I'd say is, thank you for doing your work out there. Mark Martins for those of you who don't know about this group, the Rule of Law Field Force was run by a fellow named Mark Martins, General Mark Martins, who is probably one of the smartest and most accomplished JAG lawyers you will ever meet. And if you Google him, you'll find that there's some great profiles about what he's come to and his background. And it's an extraordinary thing trying to actually do rule of law work in the field everywhere, not everywhere, but in many places in Afghanistan, not just in Kabul. And in some ways, what's one of the striking things about it is you were there in 2011. It didn't really get started until that late in the game. We've been there since 2001. That's a long ways before you had a full rule of law effort that the military was engaged in this way. I guess I see the same thing that you're seeing, and I see it not just in the military, but more broadly in policy, which is, there's less interest in doing nation building abroad and more interest in doing nation building at home. And as a result, across the board, there's a shift away from doing the kind of preparation that you might need to do to engage in these large-scale nation-building programs, and instead into more indirect and smaller kinds of things. And so security force assistance is this indirect approach of helping others do their own work without us directly being involved in the operation. So I see that moving in the same way as where you've seen it. And I think the question that all of us have to ask in some ways, just as citizens and as people, is if even if that's what we prefer as a matter of policy, is it still useful to be thinking that we should have some people, even if it's a smaller set, who are thinking about the more intensive types of operations in case we end up being involved in something? And there's trade-offs and reasons why. Maybe there's an argument that goes like this. If you don't have any capacity to do it, you will be less likely to do it. So if your goal is to not do it, the best thing is to have no capacity. Now there's another argument, which is we have civilian control over the military, and sometimes civilians decide to do things, and maybe they don't have the best judgment about what will happen the day after the bombing, and as a result get involved in deep ways in wars that we then don't have any capacity for. So I think that's a very hard question, but it is one that is worth our thinking about. Do we want to be prepared as a country to do these kinds of operations, or do we not want to be prepared? And if we're not going to be prepared, then when people are asking the country to go to war, we need to be seriously thinking about what happens when we get there, and what happens when the war turns in a direction that may not be as easy as people may have thought.
I want to thank you for your refreshingly optimistic view of international affairs. And I want to thank again the Palmers for supporting this series. And more importantly, as you leave, grab a book. Pay for it though. Thanks again for coming.